He was one of the most beloved presidents in American history. But when Ronald Reagan passed away in 2004, he had been out of the public eye for a decade. After he told the world he'd been diagnosed with Alzheimer's, not much has been revealed about what went on during his final years until now. Have a look.
Much has been written about Ronald Reagan's early life and his 8 years in the White House. But in 1994, just a few years after he left office, Reagan announced in a letter to the nation that he had the beginnings of Alzheimer's disease. For the last decade of his life, there were no public appearances, and little is known about his final years. In a new book, Last Act, The Final Years and Emerging Legacy of Ronald Reagan, author Craig Shirley writes about Reagan's twilight years and sheds new light on how he and Mrs. Reagan dealt with the diagnosis and progression of the disease, the planning of the state funeral, the outpouring from the nation, and the significance of the Reagan legacy.
Well, we loved him, and I was there in the National Cathedral for the funeral, and there were some of the people who'd worked with him who were literally crying. I mean, grown men, tears rolling down their cheeks because they loved this man so much. Author Craig Shirley joins us now from Washington. We welcome you to the 700 Club.
Thank you, Pat, very much.
Listen, you know, I talked to Paul Laxalt, who told me that when Reagan was running for office, he was excoriated so much by the press that Paul said we couldn't let him see the papers. The things were written about him were so scathing. What do you think about that?
Well, that sounds, Senator Laxalt is a pretty accurate recorder of history, and that sounds pretty accurate. You know, Reagan was able to tune out much of what the national media said about him and focus on his message to the American people. As a matter of fact, he preferred the newspapers of small-town America so he could read about Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts and basically get a handle on the American people, whom he was always in touch with. He never cared much about the elites. He never cared much about Washington, but he did care very much about what the American people were thinking.
Well, you know, he was brilliant. I remember there was a birthday of him and Margaret Thatcher and so forth, and there was a speech he gave, and I told our guy, I said, look, can you get that comedy writer for me? He's brilliant. I'd like him to do a few speeches for me. And they checked on it, and they said Reagan wrote the stuff himself. Is that the way it was?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, Gerald Ford actually had two comedy writers on the White House speechwriting staff. Reagan never had any comedy writers. He wrote all of his own material. You know, he had speechwriters, and it was a very fine, probably the best complement of speechwriters in the history of the White House. But Reagan took a lot of personal interest in all of his speeches, and all the speechwriters told me about how their drafts would come back with the Oval Office with a lot of lines written, you know, drawn through and edits made and things like that. He took a lot of personal interest in the spoken word.
Well, he was portrayed as kind of a bumbling actor who was, you know, not quite with it and slept during meetings. Well, what's the truth about him?
The truth is that this was a very engaged, bright, erudite, interested man. He chaired hundreds and hundreds of meetings of the National Security Council and its sub-planning meeting. He was as bright and as engaged the day he left office in January of '89 as he was the day he entered office in January of 1981. You ask any aide who worked for him, you look at his diaries, you look at his writings, you look at his schedule. He was vital and he was active, and it's just a complete myth that has been promulgated by the liberal media and his liberal opponents to say that he was at early onslaught of Alzheimer's or that he was out of touch. All the evidence is to the contrary. Not one person who ever worked for Ronald Reagan has stepped forward and said anything other than he was a bright and engaged man.
Well, what about the funeral? I was there, as I say, in the National Cathedral, and it was a very moving event. And then they took his casket out to California. What's the backstory on that one?
Well, the backstory is that, again, it was the schism, and I was there too, and I remember seeing you there, Pat, in the National Cathedral, but the great schism between the American people and the American elites. The whole week of the Reagan funeral, the American liberal elites were denouncing him and criticizing him in the most personal vicious manner. You know, he's gonna turn crispy brown, and he's a killer, and he's a con man, and all sorts of ugly, awful things. And yet, the vast majority of the American people thought otherwise. And of course, you remember the turnout at the Capitol, hundreds of thousands of people turning out to view his coffin, and the spontaneous turning out of hundreds of thousands of people at Simi Valley, and all walks of life from all places, all corners of the country. So it was the story of really two different Americas the week of the Reagan funeral: the real America and the elite America. And the real America, I think, won the day and won the debate.
Well, you know, I personally just felt so drawn to him. I mean, you just had a fondness in your heart for him, and it was a great tragedy to me that he passed off the scene. But I've said in speeches he made us proud to be Americans again, and I think he did. What was the appeal that Reagan had to somebody like me or like the average man on the street? Well, what was it?
I think he said it himself. He told Lou Cannon, who is another Reagan biographer, a great Reagan biographer, is that he was in touch with the American people because he saw himself as one of them. He never saw himself as one of the Washington elites. You know, in 8 years of his diaries recorded every night, he never mentioned watching the Sunday shows. He didn't care about what they were saying, the elites were saying about him on Sunday. He cared about what the American people were saying about him. He didn't need focus groups because he was his own focus group. He was constantly in touch with the American people. So I think that in his farewell address, he said his two greatest accomplishments were the restoration of the American morale and the restoration of the American economy. And obviously, several years later came the defeat of Soviet communism, which I would consider to be his greatest accomplishment.
Well, you know, I remember Jimmy Carter's aide saying to me, well, we don't want to get in a, quote, arms race. But Reagan got into it, and he said, this is the game. We win, they lose. It was just that simple.
Yeah, exactly. And he did it quite deliberately in the face of enormous pressure. He deployed, you remember in 1982, the nuclear freeze movement that was rising in America, and we later found out it was being funded by the KGB. But there was a great deal of pressure on Reagan to cancel the deployment of Pershing II missiles in Western Europe. And he went ahead, and that made a great impression on the Soviets that this was not a weakling, this was a very determined man. And the Soviets, like him or hate him, is that they always respected strength, which is why they always respected Richard Nixon, and they learned to respect Ronald Reagan. And even more so, you know, it's interesting, a lot of former Soviet officials were more effusive about Ronald Reagan after he died than were a lot.
Well, they met in Reykjavik, he and the head of the Soviet Union, and they were making incredible concessions, and the media was saying, oh, you've got to take this deal, and Reagan said, no, I'm not giving up Star Wars, and that brought down the Soviet Union. What about that?
Well, it was interesting because, again, he walked away from Reykjavik. Reagan was a terrific poker player. He was holding basically a pair of deuces with just a theory. SDI was at the point in 1986, it was just a theory. And Gorbachev is holding three kings, and yet he forces Gorbachev to bluff and fold his hand. And I can imagine Gorbachev going back and telling the Soviet generals that he gave up missile reduction in exchange for a theory. So I always thought it was interesting. But Reykjavik was an important turning point, and some historians said it was the beginning of the end of the Cold War because Reagan did not cave as previous presidents might have done.
The last one, I'd love to talk to you because to say the least, I'm a great friend and fan of Reagan. I had the chance of being with him on a couple of occasions. It was very moving. But the thing that was so impressive that we remember when he went to Berlin and he said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall, the speechwriters said the State Department was apoplectic at that. They just hated it. Go ahead. Talk about it.
Well, no, you're absolutely right, Pat, is that, you know, he drafted it, and the State Department vetted the speech, and they took it out, went back to Reagan, he put it back in, went back to the State Department, they took it out, went back to Reagan, he put it back in, went back to the speech of the State Department, they took it out, and after 3 or 4 or 5 times of this back and forth, it stays in the speech. But that was very much in character for Ronald Reagan. In 1980, he wanted to call the Vietnam War a noble cause. And his speechwriter said, Mr. President, you can't call Vietnam a noble cause. You know, there was the Pentagon was evil. There was moral equivalency between North and South Vietnam. And it's just a taboo subject. And Reagan wanted to. His speechwriters took it out repeatedly. He added it repeatedly. And he told the American Legion, the American people, that Vietnam was a noble cause. And the elites, of course, despised it and denounced him for it. But the American people loved it.
Last question. We've got a president now who would like to compare himself to Ronald Reagan. You want to comment on that one?
Sure. Is that they are the polar opposite of each other. And I mean that very seriously in a context of history. Reagan believed in the spiritual individual. He was very infused with his Christianity. He reached out to John Hinckley to privately tell him that he forgave him, which I think is the ultimate expression of Christian forgiveness. Hinckley's doctors advised against it because Hinckley would interpret it wrong and that it somehow was vindication for what he did. So Reagan ended up not meeting with Hinckley. But he very much believed in the individual, and he believed in the spiritual individual. Barack Obama believes in the state. He has a naive belief that the government can solve every problem. And so, therefore, the two are just completely opposite of each other. One believes in the individual, one believes in the state. So, in a way, is that comparing himself to Reagan is right, but only in a reverse sort of way.
Craig, I hope your book is successful. It's called The Last Act. It's got some of these wonderful anecdotes about Reagan that I think you'll find appealing. Is the book doing well? It's out on Amazon now?
Yeah, it is. It just came out last week, and I'm told by the publisher it's selling very well. So it's in Barnes & Noble and Amazon and Costco and other fine bookstores.
Well, thank you, Craig Shirley. For those of us who loved Ronald Reagan, I think you'll find it very moving. Craig Shirley, thank you so much.